To all our viewers around the world, Shalom from Jerusalem. This is another Middle East review program of TV7. I am Danny Ayalon. With me, as usual, my good friend, Colonel Reserve Intelligence, Dr. Eran Lerman. How are you?
Fine under the circumstances.
Yes, unfortunately, we have had this passing week a terrible terror attack, which still is under investigation, but there is no end to the murderous ideology and conduct of the Palestinians. I have no doubt that our very effective intelligence services will find the culprits. I would say that so far it seems like it has been an organized activity, not just one of the ramming or
Two
stabbing.
bombings almost at the same time, coordinated to do the utmost damage. It looks like this is not a lone wolf's operation.
It's not. And unfortunately, we know that there is a lot of incitement going on in the Middle East, mostly by Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, Muslim Brotherhoods. But this is something that we have been facing for generations now. Unfortunately, we are at the seam lines, of civilizations here, Judeo-Christian and radical Muslim. And again, I don't include all Muslims, but radical
ultimately,
Muslims.
it's a battle within Islam.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the Islamists, the totalitarian ideologues who have perverted Islam in the last 100 years, are using attacks on us and on others in the world, as we saw at 9/11 and so on, actually to claim their superiority upon the more moderate forces, which definitely exist. I've just come back from Morocco. I've seen a very different life.
Of course.
A very different attitude on the part of a Muslim government towards the West, towards Israel, towards the Jewish people. So I'm very wary of generalizing, but I will clearly, what we see is a pattern of Islamist totalitarian ideology using terror as its tool.
No, absolutely. And, there are many divides within Islam. And I am very careful to say it's not Islam, it's radical Islam, which has been motivated by Tehran and other places. Gaza is one of them. My issue with the moderate Islam is that not that they acquiesce, but they do not condemn harshly enough. And by not condemning and disassociating themselves from this radical Islam, I think this paints the entire Islam in a very, very bad picture. But this is something for the Islam and the Muslims to sort out. In any case, we see that still the strategic problem and danger in the region and in the world has been and is going to be even further and in a more acute way, Iran. We have been, of course, witness to the condemnations of the IAEA, calling them to task, the Iranians, for not being transparent enough about the 3 sites where residual nuclear material has been inspected, and they are denying any access. And actually, these 3 files for the Iranians is a condition not to move forward with the new JCPOA.
The Iranians made it very clear that, among other things, they basically demand that the IAEA should betray its mission, should betray its credibility, and simply close these files without sufficient answers from the Iranian.
That could be the end of the NPT.
That could put a very serious hole in the NPT under the waterline, indeed. And when they faced a rebuttal, which was, I have to say, we need to give credit to the present Secretary Grossi, who's doing a very different job from some of his...
Rafael Grossi, yeah.
Grossi, who's doing some very different job from some of his more, lenient predecessors.
Maybe naive, you may say.
Naive or worse.
Or worse.
Naive or complicit. But Amano was firm, and he is definitely firm. And he's sending, and this resolution sends a double message. First of all, the IAEA will not fold, and the key European players who were for years now, denounced the Trump withdrawal in 2018 and supported wholeheartedly a return to the JCPOA, have now joined the chorus of condemnation. Of course, this has to do with Iran's nuclear conduct, and Iran's response made things worse and,
what do you
more
make?
immediate.
Yes. First of all, can you tell us what was the Iran's response and what do you make of it?
They openly announced, and this has been confirmed by IAEA monitoring, that they are pushing up the level of enrichment to 60%. Now,
adding 1,000 more cascades?
And they basically broke all the limitations of the JCPOA
both in
already,
and
step by. But this is taking place in Fordow, which is supposed to be much better defended against potential attack.
Under the mountain.
It's deeper under the mountain. I don't know if the Americans decide to use their MOP, their massive ordnance penetrator. I don't envy the Iranians who will be inside the compound, but. Having said so, they are pushing to 60%. Now, for those of our listeners who no longer remember the former Prime Minister and future Prime Minister Netanyahu drawing his bomb caricature in the UN, 60% uranium-235 is not yet military grade, but it's a very short hop from there to 90 plus. Which is military grade. Military grade means that if you shoot a neutron into a piece of uranium-235 enriched to that level, you will get a very quick chain reaction, which basically equates with a nuclear explosion. That's to say, we are coming to the very edge of a military-grade capability. Not
Iran,
yet a bomb.
As long as we talk about some technicalities, you mentioned, of course, the massive ordnance of the, they used to call it daisy cutters or whatever, massive bombs that only the
MOP and the Moab, the mother of all bombs.
Right, which would be only 1 grade below a tactical nuclear weapon, I would say.
It's a conventional weapon.
Yes.
And that makes all the difference in the world, because the Americans are now signaling very brutally to Putin, don't make that mistake, don't cross that threshold. They have no intention, and I think in technical terms, they probably have no need to cross that threshold.
Because it can cause almost similar damage as a tactical nuclear
to an underground facility, yes.
Yeah.
But it has a very different effect above ground. The long and the short of it, we are at the conjunction of 4 things happening all at once. The JCPOA negotiations have collapsed, and it's very difficult to bring them back on track. Iran is increasingly defiant and making the breakout time towards let's say, enough nuclear material for a bomb shorter and shorter. At the same time, we have the Iranian alliance with Russia, the supply of the Shahed 136 drones and other technologies, the ultimate irony that Iran should be supplying Russia. Which
speaks of the Russians more than the Iranians.
It's a sad comment on the how the Russians were caught flat-footed by this war, which is already becoming quite evident.
Which they had planned, so this is even worse in terms of bumbling it up.
Sometimes it is when you think you are the planner and you're in control that you are most surprised by the problems of your own making. The long and the short of it, this alliance with Russia has blotted Iran's copybook in the West, because there's very deep sympathy in Europe now for the Ukrainians as they advance. And then add to all of this the dramatic ongoing protests, which have crossed I think they are far more effective now than they've been in 2009. They've spread all over the country. What they
You're
lack...
talking about the hijab revolt,
protest,
or maybe revolution almost.
It's shifting gears from protest to revolt, and from revolt to an insurrection, when ultimately it could become a revolution. The regime is shaky, and it is increasingly violent, and the violence does not put an end to the protest. The numbers are growing. Women of prominence, actresses and so on, are taking a public stand, knowing that they would be arrested for it. We need to talk, obviously, about the ongoing World Cup, the Mondial in Qatar, but in political terms, the scene of the Iranian soccer team refusing to sing the national anthem as an act of protest. It's like you could compare this to American football players kneeling, but this is a very different situation. Nobody in America would shoot a protester. These people are risking their freedom when they come home, not because they lost so badly to England.
No, absolutely. And
I saw the title in one of the Iranian papers. It said, Iran 2, England, Israel, and the traitors 6. As if, they suffered the defeat because
of a coalition against them.
A coalition against. This is a regime which is becoming very dangerous because it is being seriously challenged.
And I believe, it seems like they're almost desperate if they turn into such, I would say, a blatantly cheap and blatantly a lie about, that Israel, together with the UK and the US, are turning and moving it also to the soccer. I think it shows a lot of
stress,
instability, and stress, and more than just this silent demonstration by the soccer team.
And by the way, they throw in also Daesh,
of course,
ISIL.
Of course.
They're also part of
this.
And the Saudis and all the crocodiles and the monkeys and all against Iran. Poor little Iran that did nothing.
They think that because of Daesh has very poor image in the West, they can drive a wedge maybe between the allies in the West.
How you can associate Daesh or ISIL, Islamic State, with hijab burners, I don't know. I mean,
exactly.
It just, I agree with you. It indicates a point of almost of depravity. And things are getting, the foundations of the regime are being challenged. The other day, demonstrators burned down the museum at the birthplace of Khomeini in the village of Khomeini. That's not just to say the present leadership is useless. It's to say that the entire Islamic revolution has lost its legitimacy.
Let's drill down. This is very interesting because what you say here is, we have experienced in the last, let's say, 2 decades, a few, let's say, demonstrations and outbreaks of maybe even insurrection. We remember the 2009, the Green Revolution, which was maybe on the cusp of moving into an insurgency. But it seems like there is a big difference now because in the past, it was more of economic issues, the miners maybe striking. Here, it goes down to the core of the ideology of this regime, which is a very, very, I would say, pious and very religious ideology of Islam. And here, starting with the women, and we see basically, the women today in the world are empowered. It's not what they used to be. We could see it in the West with the Me Too phenomenon. It seems like the Me Too phenomenon has been emigrating to Iran as a hijab demonstration.
Well, and I hear that women leaders from around the world are adding their voice to the support, the growing support. This makes it impossible, to the best of my understanding, impossible for countries like Germany, France, Britain, and Biden's United States to all of a sudden turn around and throw a lifeline to the Iranian regime.
Because it's not politically correct.
It's no longer political. These are people who are butchering women and children.
Eran, we have spoken about it many times before. 2009, there was a missed opportunity. It was then President Obama actually who threw the demonstrators in Iran in 2009 under the bus, while 2 years later he was supporting the demonstrators against an ally of the United States in Egypt, Mubarak, which was unexplained.
I spoke at the time to a prominent Palestinian, and said, "Do you want to know why we are afraid of doing anything anymore that involves relying on the United States? Just look at what they did to Mubarak."
Absolutely.
So, it left a mark. What the Green Revolution of 2009 had, and this insurrection or revolt does not yet have, is a leadership. At the time, there were people identified as potential leaders. Now it's really on one side this is very impressive because it's spontaneous, it's burning across the country without an organized chain of command. On the other hand, you do need at a certain point a leadership to make it coherent, effective. If it is to take the next step and destabilize the regime altogether. But we are living through a very dramatic period of time. Unfortunately, we cannot gamble on the success of this insurrection, of this extremely legitimate insurrection that all of us should sympathize with. But we cannot assume that this will resolve the Iranian nuclear portfolio.
So what would take?
So we may need to actually think again about a credible military threat and potentially credible military action.
Before then, what would make it an effective insurrection, I would say, leading into a revolution? And why am I asking that? Because the Iranians, of course, blame the incitement inside on the Zionist regime, on the United States, and others. So my question to you is, should the free world intervene in helping the poor Iranians, and especially the poor women of Iran now? And if they do, in what way? And if they do, is it counterproductive or is it going to help the demonstrations?
I think that taking a very overt, first of all, a military intervention or anything of the sort, physical intervention in the situation is totally irrelevant. Iran is not. This is not Iraq.
This should be.
It's a nation of 90 million, and you cannot land in Tehran and make a difference. No. That's out. So what is in? At one level, we can pour in expressions of concrete support and so on. Money, whatever, but that would easily help the regime validate its claims that this is a foreign conspiracy. But what needs to be done, and I would carefully say, to the best of my understanding, is being done, is to facilitate the communications.
You mean covert operations? Or?
No, to break the ability of the regime to strangle the social networks that enable people to communicate across Iran.
Is it like what Elon Musk did to help a Ukrainian deflect the cyber attacks of the Russians?
That's the kind of thing that the regime wants to basically choke off the internet altogether. And there are ways of overriding such a regime repressive action in the realm, in the cyber realm, in the world of the social networks, because the social networks, as we saw in 2011 in Egypt and elsewhere, and in many other places since, they are vital to the ability of people, young people, to coordinate their actions in such a situation. So that's something that the West could do and should do.
And certainly, a military operation is not in the cards. It doesn't make any sense.
Not in that field, but
Not
it
in that
is.
field.
It could
right.
be in the cards in the context of the nuclear project.
And should be saved and spared specifically for a strategic threat to the entire world. And this is with a ramping up of the nuclear efforts of Iran, maybe them getting into almost a point of no return. Although, even though they do get the 90%, they still have about a year and a half or 2 years until they weaponize
to
it.
tool a device into
Exactly.
a weapon. They are not the same thing. What was tested in Los Alamos in July 45, the first nuclear explosion achieved by humans, was a device. It could not be delivered. Later, within weeks, they already had a bomb. 2 bombs. That's
Fat
all
man.
the U.S. had. The Japanese did not know it. They
Little boy and
the
fat
little
man.
boy, fat man. And that is, but to tool a device into a bomb that can be deliverable by aircraft or on a warhead of a missile, that is an art that would take some more time. But this is no longer a bottleneck. The bottleneck is enrichment. So we are coming to the very, very dangerous crossroads in the entire Iranian complex. And all of this while the world is celebrating something else that's happening in the Middle East, which for all the pain and the moral questioning that attended it, the World Cup in Qatar is turning out to be, as usual, a grand display of sport. But let's remember, not only did the Qataris spend the lives of thousands of workers, mostly from the Indian subcontinent, who died in working in very difficult conditions to build these grand stadia, which, by the way, will be of no use after the games, because Qatar has very little by way of a football culture.
Unless they will pay themselves again to get another Mondial or maybe even Olympics.
There's
in
a
few
limit.
years.
There's a limit to everything, I think. But it turns out that it's clearly a lot of money poured into getting FIFA to bring the games to Qatar. And at the end of the day, it's a country that has dressed up as a legitimate member of the international community, but remains a fountainhead of hate, of support for the Muslim Brotherhood's subversion, of hostility, deep hostility to the others in the region who are more closely allied with the West. They've paradoxically kept themselves out of America's orbit of anger by allowing the Americans to maintain a major airfield there. But Qatar is a problematic player, no matter how well they've organized the games.
But some Iran, tell me if you think that it is true. Some say that actually, there is no, it's obvious that Qatar, a small desert kingdom with some natural gas in a far-flung place in the Middle East, hosting this grand event, did it only because it's paid its way up, actually purchasing it one way or another. I don't want to get into some recriminations. There was some talking about bribes. I don't know about it, and this is
as long as you don't name individuals, you're not liable for
exactly. However,
libel.
However, some say that it was obvious. It's very ostentatious, and you see very lavish with all the money thrown in. But at the same time, they may have shot themselves, and obviously they did it for good.
The ultimate irony is this. The ultimate irony is this. They've done all this to get the world's attention. And who gets the world's attention? Their hated neighbors, the Saudis, who beat
Argentina,
the world
champ.
After 36 consecutive games without a loss, the Argentinians lost to Saudi Arabia on Qatari soil. And the Qataris were so overwhelmed that even the Prince of the ruler put a Saudi flag on his shoulder. Ironies abound in all of this because the Saudis just a few years ago led a boycott,
of course,
and the siege
of the GCC countries,
of the GCC plus Egypt against Qatar. So look how things turn. Maybe this would be all for the good in the sense that Qatar would find a way to repent on its past behavior, but that's a bit optimistic.
But with all this grandeur, and this is really is very well oiled run, but didn't the Qataris shoot themselves in the hand with their refusal to recognize, the gay presence? They are not allowing even the gay flag. Women's are put down. All these things actually show again Qatar as a very backward country.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a question of.
Is this what they paid for?
Yeah, Qatar is a paradoxical place because, yes, they've tried to ingratiate themselves with the West, even with us in our days. I remember in the 90s running into Qatari diplomats in the arms control negotiations. One of them was very effusive, handshake and niceties. The other treated me as thin air. This was actually the bearded one. What happened to Qatar is that while the Saudis played with the Muslim Brotherhood as a tool, the Qataris were actually not careful enough with the surgical glove. It got into their bloodstream, the ideology of the Brotherhood, all the way to Sheikh Hamoza and the influential elements in Qatar. And so it is an Ikhwanji state, and that's where the problem lies.
And this they cannot masquerade, nor can they cover, even with such a grand event as the Mondial. Well, thank you all for watching. This was another episode of Middle Eastern Review, actually mixing football with politics.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.